The wind was a living thing that night, a predator hunting across the endless white plains of Nebraska. Inside her small sod cabin, a single candle flame danced, the only star in a universe of swirling snow. She was utterly alone, miles from any neighbor, a ghost in a world erased by the storm. Then came the sound that should have been impossible, a knocking at the door, faint but firm. It was a sound that defied the blizzard, a sound that promised either salvation or damnation. For the woman inside who had prayed for any soul to break the silence, this was the moment her prayer was answered. And her nightmare began. The silence was the first thing that truly unnerved Maeve. It wasn't the quiet of a peaceful night. It was a heavy, profound emptiness that pressed in from all sides, a silence born of a world smothered under a thick blanket of snow. Outside, the great blizzard of '88 had descended without warning, a sudden furious onslaught of white that had turned the familiar Nebraskan sandhills into an alien landscape. One moment, the children at the small schoolhouse a few miles away were looking at a calm grey sky. The next, a wall of ice and wind was devouring the horizon. Maeve had been lucky. She'd felt the shift in the air, a peculiar drop in pressure that her late husband Liam had taught her to recognize. She'd gotten the last of the cattle into the lean-to and reinforced the door just as the first needle-sharp flakes began to fly. Now 2 days had bled into one another, marked only by the guttering of the tallow candles and the slow consumption of firewood. Her home was a soddy, a house built of prairie turf, its thick earthen walls a good defense against the wind. But it was small, a single room that served as kitchen, bedroom, and living space. In the oppressive quiet, the cabin felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb waiting for its occupant. Loneliness was a familiar ache for Maeve, a phantom limb where her life with Liam used to be. But this was different. This was an isolation so complete, it felt like the world beyond her four walls had ceased to exist entirely. The wind howled, a chorus of mourning voices clawing at the wooden shutters. The fine, flower-like Sioux found its way through every minuscule crack, dusting the floorboards and the edge of her quilt with a faint, chilling powder. Her dog, a scruffy mutt named Jeb, whined low in his throat, his body pressed tight against her legs as she sat by the hearth. The fire was her anchor, a small, defiant pocket of warmth and life against the all-consuming cold. It was during a momentary lull in the wind's assault that she heard it. Thump, thump, thump. Maeve froze her hand hovering over Jeb's head. The dog's whining stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl, the fur along his spine standing rigid. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the sudden, terrifying silence. It was impossible. No one could be out in this. The storm was a killer, a sudden freezer, the papers would later call it, catching men and livestock in the open and turning them to statues of ice. To travel in it was suicide. Thump, 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 louder this time, more insistent. It was real. Someone was at her door. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the dull ache of her solitude. Who could it be? A neighbor in desperate trouble, a lost traveler? Or something worse, the frontier was a place of decent folk, but it was also a refuge for men running from the law, from their pasts, from themselves. Liam had left her with a sturdy axe and his prized rifle, a Springfield Model 1873. It was a powerful single-shot U.S. Army issue, reliable and deadly accurate. It now rested on pegs above the hearth, a silent guardian. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice raspy and thin. A man's voice answered, torn apart by the wind, but audible. "Help, please. Lost in the storm." The voice was deep, but strained, cracked with cold and exhaustion. It wasn't the gruff bark of a demanding outlaw, but the desperate plea of a dying man. Jeb continued to growl a deep, rumbling warning. "Hush, Jeb," Maeve whispered, though she trusted the dog's instincts more than her own. But the thought of someone freezing to death on her doorstep, the ghost of their last hope haunting her conscience, was a burden she couldn't bear. Liam wouldn't have let a man die, no matter the risk. "Stand back from the door," she commanded, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. She moved with purpose, grabbing the heavy iron poker from the hearth. It wasn't the Springfield, but it was something. She slid the heavy wooden bar from across the door, the sound deafening in the small space. Grasping the latch, she took a deep breath, the cold from the wood seeping into her palm, and pulled the door inward. The storm lunged into the cabin, a furious blast of wind and snow that extinguished the candle on the table and sent papers fluttering. The fire roared in protest embers flying from the hearth. And in the doorway, a figure stood, a colossus of snow and ice, more apparition than man. He was tall, his frame made immense by the layers of frost and snow, caked onto his long duster. A wide-brimmed hat, heavy with ice, shadowed his face. He swayed on his feet, one hand braced against the doorframe, the other clutching a satchel. Slowly, as if the movement cost him the last of his strength, he looked up. Maeve's breath caught in her throat. Even through the rime of ice clinging to his eyebrows and beard, his face was striking. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes of a startling pale blue, the color of a winter sky just before dusk. They were eyes that seemed to drink in the light from her fire, reflecting it with an unnerving intensity. He wasn't some grizzled, weather-beaten trapper. He looked refined despite his condition. "Thank you." He breathed the words, turning to vapor in the frigid air. Then his legs buckled, and he collapsed forward onto the cabin floor, the door slamming shut behind him with a deafening crash, plunging the room into near darkness, save for the flickering firelight. For a moment, Maeve could only stare at the heap on her floor. Jeb barked wildly, a frantic, high-pitched sound that was more fear than aggression. "Hush!" She snapped her own fear, making her sharp. Action finally broke through her paralysis. This was a man, freezing to death. Whatever threat he might pose was secondary to the immediate danger the cold presented. She knelt beside him, her hands recoiling at the chill seeping through his coat. It was like touching a block of ice. "Mister, can you hear me?" He groaned, a low animal sound of pain. Working quickly, she wrestled him out of his snow-crusted duster. It was impossibly heavy. Beneath it, he wore a simple woolen shirt and trousers, shockingly inadequate for the weather. His hands were raw, chapped, and turning a mottled blue-gray. His satchel, a sturdy leather thing, had fallen beside him. She pushed it aside, her focus entirely on the man. "We have to get you warm," she muttered, as much to herself as to him. "Jeb, get back." With strength she didn't know she possessed, she dragged him closer to the fire, propping his back against a wooden chest. His head lolled to the side. His breathing was shallow, ragged. She chafed his hands, the friction doing little against the deep, penetrating cold. Snow and ice clung to his dark hair and beard. Gently, she began to brush it away, her fingers touching his skin. It was strange. His skin was cold, Yes, but beneath the surface cold, there was a stillness, a lack of the faint, vibrant warmth that even a freezing person should possess. It was a deep, profound cold that seemed to come from within him, not just from the storm. Dismissing it as a trick of her panicked mind, she fetched a rough woolen blanket and draped it over him, tucking it tightly around his shoulders. She threw another log on the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The flames leaped higher, casting dancing shadows on the walls, making the small cabin feel even more claustrophobic. She watched him, the poker still clutched in her hand. The firelight played across his features. As the ice in his beard began to melt, she saw his face more clearly. He was younger than she first thought, perhaps 30 years of age. There were no scars, no brandings, none of the typical marks of a hard life on the plains. There was an elegance to his features that seemed out of place, a stark contrast to his desperate condition. Hours passed. Maeve did not sleep. She sat in her rocking chair, the Springfield now laid across her lap, watching the stranger breathe. His recovery was unnatural. She had seen men frostbitten before. She knew the slow, agonizing process of warming them, the pain, the shivering, the delirium. This man did not shiver. His breathing, once shallow, soon deepened into a slow, rhythmic cadence, as if he were merely in a deep sleep. The frightening blue-grey tinge of his skin receded, replaced not by the flushed red of returning circulation, but by a pale, almost luminous pallor. He looked less like a man recovering from the cold, and more like a statue slowly thawing, revealing the perfect form beneath. Sometime near what she guessed was dawn, his eyes snapped open. Not fluttered, not slowly opened, but snapped open with a sudden, unnerving awareness. His pale blue eyes locked directly onto hers. There was no confusion, no disorientation. It was a look of pure, focused intelligence. "My apologies for the intrusion," he said. His voice no longer cracked and strained, but a smooth, resonant baritone. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being heard. "You have a brave heart, madam." Maeve tightened her grip on the rifle. Most folks would have done the same. He offered a small, disarming smile. It didn't quite reach his eyes. Few would have done it with such quiet competence. "My name is Silas." "Maeve," she replied, her voice flat. "You were lucky. The storm came on fast." "Luck had little to do with it," Silas said, his gaze flicking around the cabin, taking in every detail. The sturdy walls, the sparse but well-kept furnishings, the rifle in her lap. "I was looking for shelter. I found it." His confidence was unsettling. He spoke as if his survival had been a foregone conclusion. Jeb, who had been hiding under the small bed, let out another low growl. Silas's eyes shifted to the dog, and his smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Your dog doesn't seem to care for me." "He's protective," Maeve said. "As he should be," Silas replied, turning his gaze back to her. "The world is full of things to be protected from, but sometimes the greatest dangers are the ones we invite inside." His words hung in the air, heavy and full of unspoken meaning. The storm still raged outside, a constant howling reminder of their confinement. But Maeve suddenly knew with a certainty that chilled her far more than the blizzard ever could, that the true storm was not outside her cabin. It was inside, sitting by her fire, wrapped in her blanket, and watching her with eyes the color of ice. The man she had saved from the cold was not just a man. He was something else entirely, and she had just locked the door. The cabin, once a refuge, had become a cup. The world outside remained a maelstrom of white, the wind a relentless banshee. Inside, a different kind of storm was brewing, a tempest of suspicion and unnatural calm that centered entirely on the man named Silas. He had recovered with an impossible speed. Within hours of his collapse, he was moving about the small space with a quiet, deliberate grace that belied his near-death experience. He was courteous, his manners impeccable. He spoke of art and literature from back east of cities like Boston and Philadelphia in a way that made it clear he wasn't merely repeating tales he'd heard. He was a man of education and refinement. Yet here he was, freezing in the Nebraska wilderness with nothing but a satchel and clothes unfit for a mild autumn day. The pieces did not fit. Maeve kept her distance, her senses on high alert. She moved around the cabin with the practiced efficiency of a woman who knew her domain, making coffee, slicing bread, trying to maintain a veneer of normalcy. But every nerve ending screamed that nothing was normal. Jeb refused to come out from under the bed, his occasional growls the only honest sound in the room. "He truly has a distaste for me," Silas commented, watching Maeve place a mug of steaming coffee on the small table. He sat in the chair she usually occupied, a place of honor by the fire, looking as if he belonged there more than she did. "Jeb's never been good with strangers," Maeve lied. The truth was, Jeb loved people. He was a fool for a scratched ear or a kind word. His terror was specific, personal. Silas took a sip of the coffee, his pale eyes closing for a moment. "My thanks. It's been some time since I've tasted anything so real." A strange choice of words. She watched him over the rim of her own mug. He ate the bread she offered with a polite, measured hunger. But his eyes were ravenous. They followed the movement of her hands, the sway of her dress, the pulse that beat in her throat with an intensity that felt predatory. It was a look she had seen before in the gaze of a coyote watching a lone hen, a patient, calculating hunger that had nothing to do with food. That afternoon she insisted on tending to his hands, which had been a raw, chapped mess. "They'll fester if you don't see to them," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. He extended them without protest, as she gently cleaned them with a warm cloth and applied a salve Liam had used for rope burns. She felt it again, that deep, unnatural cold. His skin was no longer icy to the touch, but it lacked any genuine warmth. It was like touching smooth, cool marble. More unsettling, however, was the discovery that there was no real damage. The angry red and purple hues she had seen when he arrived had faded completely, leaving behind flawless, pale skin. There was no blistering, no sign of the severe frostbite he should have had. "You heal fast," she remarked, trying to keep her voice casual as she wrapped them in clean strips of linen. His lips curved into that familiar, unreadable smile. "I've always been resilient." He leaned back, his gaze fixed on her. "Tell me about yourself, Maeve. A woman like you, living out here alone. It's a hard life. What keeps you here?" The question was personal, invasive, yet his tone was so smooth it almost felt like genuine concern. "My husband built this place," she said, pulling back. "It's my home." "Your husband? He is? Away?" Silas asked, though the past tense in his voice suggested he already knew the answer. "He's gone," Maeve said shortly. "Fever 2 winters back." The pain of the loss was a dull, constant companion. But speaking of it to this man felt like baring her throat to a wolf. "I am sorry for your loss," he said, and for a fleeting moment his eyes held a flicker of something that resembled sympathy. Loneliness can be a cold companion, colder than any blizzard. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a confidential, almost hypnotic murmur. It eats at you. It leaves you hollow. A hollow place is an invitation for things to enter. A chill utterly unrelated to the storm traced its way down Maeve's spine. His words felt less like a condolence and more like a diagnosis, or a threat. The first concrete sign that something was deeply wrong came that night. The storm had not abated, and they had settled into an uneasy truce of silence. Maeve lay on her cot, the Springfield beside her under the quilt, feigning sleep. Silas sat in the chair by the fire, a book he'd produced from his satchel in hand. For hours he didn't move, didn't turn a page. He simply stared at the book, his posture unnervingly still. Maeve must have drifted off, because she was awoken by a sound, a faint, rhythmic scraping. Her eyes snapped open to the dim, fire-lit cabin. Silas was no longer in the chair. Her heart leaped into her throat. She listened, her breathing shallow. The scraping was coming from the corner where she kept her larder, a small makeshift pantry shielded by a heavy wooden door, secured with a thick iron latch. Slowly, silently, she slipped from the bed, her bare feet cold on the floorboards. She clutched the heavy rifle, its weight a small comfort. Peeking around the edge of her cot, she saw him. Silas was crouched in front of the larder. The iron latch, which would have required a crowbar to pry open, was bent and twisted on the floor as if it were soft lead. The pantry door was ajar, and in the flickering shadows, she saw him bring something to his mouth. It was a thick slab of salt pork, one of her precious winter provisions, and he was eating it, raw. It wasn't the act itself that was so horrifying, but the way he ate. It was a frantic, silent gluttony. His head bent low, his shoulders hunched. He tore at the meat with his teeth, his jaw working with a strength that seemed inhuman. He made no sound, no grunt of satisfaction, no lip-smacking relish. It was a mechanical, desperate act of consumption, as if he were stoking a furnace that could never be filled. The firelight glinted off his eyes, and in that moment, they didn't look blue. They looked black, bottomless pits of sheer, unadulterated hunger. Fear, raw and primal, seized her. This was not a man. Men didn't break iron with their bare hands. Men didn't devour frozen salt pork as if it were a fresh apple. Her mind scrambled for an explanation, a starving man driven to madness, but her gut knew better. The unnatural healing, the pervasive cold, the dog's terror, the hypnotic voice, it all clicked into a terrifying mosaic. She backed away, her movements as quiet as a mouse. He didn't seem to notice her, lost as he was in his grotesque feast. She slid back into her bed, pulling the covers up to her chin, her body trembling uncontrollably. She lay there for what felt like an eternity, listening to the silent, frantic eating in the corner, her gaze locked on the dark shape of her unwanted guest. Eventually the sounds stopped. She heard him move, and she squeezed her eyes shut, her knuckles white on the stock of the Springfield. She felt, more than heard, his presence loom over her bed. She could feel his gaze on her face, a tangible pressure. The air grew cold, thick, with a strange ozonic scent, like the air after a lightning strike. She forced her breathing to remain even a Herculean act of will. After a long moment, he moved away. She heard the faint creak of the rocking chair as he settled back into it. She dared to open her eyes a crack. He was back where he had been, before the book open on his lap, staring into the dying embers of the fire. as if nothing had happened. Sleep was now impossible. Maeve lay awake until the first grey hint of dawn filtered through the gaps in the shutters, her mind racing. He wasn't an outlaw. He wasn't a lost traveller. The phrase from the Bible her mother used to read came to her unbidden, a wolf in sheep's clothing. But this was no mere wolf. This was something else. Something ancient and cold and terribly, terribly hungry. The storm chose that morning to relent. The howling of the wind subsided to a low, mournful moan. A pale, watery light illuminated the cabin. Silas rose from his chair and stretched a lithe, powerful movement like a panther unfolding. "It seems the world has returned," he said, his voice once again, the smooth, charming baritone. He glanced at the broken larder, then at her, and the faintest smirk touched his lips. "It appears the storm did more damage than we thought. The pressure must have warped the latch." It was a blatant, insulting lie. He was toying with her, testing her. Maeve sat up, pushing the quilt aside and revealing the Springfield rifle in her hands. She didn't point it at him, not yet. She just held it, its dark, oiled wood, a stark contrast to her white nightdress. "The storm didn't break that latch, Silas," she said, her voice low and steady, betraying none of the terror that churned in her stomach. He turned to face her fully. The charming facade fell away like a mask, leaving his face cold and impassive. The pale blue of his eyes seemed to frost over, becoming chips of ice. "No," he said, his voice losing its warmth, becoming flat and hard. "It didn't." "What are you?" she asked, the question she had been dreading. Silas took a step towards her, and Jeb let out a desperate, strangled-sounding bark from under the bed. "I am a survivor," he said, his eyes fixed on hers. "Just like you, Maeve. We do what is necessary to endure. Some of us just have a greater appetite." He took another step. The small space of the cabin shrank until it felt like a dueling ring. Maeve's heart pounded, a frantic bird against her ribs. She had invited him in, given him shelter, and now the creature she had saved was preparing to feast. The time for questions was over. The time for survival had come. She raised the heavy barrel of the Springfield rifle, the cold metal a grim reality in her hands, and aimed it squarely at the stranger's heart. The air in the cabin grew thick and heavy, charged with a silence more deafening than the blizzard's roar. The long dark barrel of the Springfield Model 1873 was steady in Maeve's hands, the brass bead of the front sight centered on Silas's chest. For a frontierswoman, a rifle was an extension of the will, and her will was now a single unyielding point of iron. He would not take another step. Silas stopped, his head tilted, with an expression of mild curiosity, as if her brandishing a deadly weapon was a quaint but ultimately trivial gesture. The last vestiges of the charming traveller had evaporated, leaving behind a being of pure Arctic stillness. A single-shot rifle, he observed his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in Maeve's bones. "Sturdy, reliable. Your husband's, I presume?" A man of practical taste. He spoke of Liam in the present tense, a deliberate, cruel jab. "You will get one shot, Maeve. You should make it count." "I only need one," she replied, her voice tight. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her belly, but it was being burned away by a pleasing, purifying anger. Anger at his deception, at his violation of her home, at the way he looked at her, as if she were already devoured. "Are you so certain?" he mused, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "What do you think I am?" Some common highwayman you can scare off with a show of force. Your dog knows, the fire knows, even the wood and the earth of this little house know. They shrink from me. He was right. As Maeve's senses sharpened, she noticed the fire in the hearth had dwindled to a sullen, fearful glow, its flames seeming to recoil from him. A line of frost, thick and feathery, was creeping across the floorboards from where he stood, defying the warmth of the cabin. "You're a monster," she breathed the word, feeling inadequate. Monster is a word people use for things they don't understand. Silas countered, taking a slow, deliberate step to the side, testing her aim. She tracked him smoothly. "I am older than the word, older than the cattle trails and the railroads you people scratch onto the face of this land. When the first winter fell upon the first lonely, starving man, I was there. I am the hunger in the dark, the cold that seeps into the bones, the quiet desperation that makes a soul do unspeakable things to survive. I am the blizzard, Maeve, not the snow and the wind, but the spirit of it, the need." His confession washed over her, not with the shock of revelation, but with the grim confirmation of what her soul already knew. He was a force of nature, an elemental thing, wearing the skin of a man. How do you kill a storm with a bullet? "Why me?" she asked, her voice a near whisper. His pale eyes seemed to soften, a deceptive, predatory tenderness entering them. "Because you were so bright, my dear. A little flame of warmth and hope and memory in an ocean of cold. So very, very lonely. A light like that doesn't just offer comfort. It calls out. It's a beacon for the hungry dark." He sighed, a sound of theatrical regret. "I was drawn to you. I will consume your warmth, your memories, your life, and it will sustain me until I find another light in the next storm. It is my nature." That was the final straw. He spoke of erasing her, of consuming Liam's memory, which she held so sacred, as if it were no more significant than eating a piece of bread. The love for her husband, the fierce pride in her own resilience, it all coalesced into a single point of fiery rage. "Then your nature is about to meet mine," she snarled. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion of the Springfield was catastrophic in the small cabin. It was a physical blow of sound and force, a blast of thunder that shook the very swords in the walls. The rifle kicked back against her shoulder with bruising power, and the room was instantly filled with the acrid smell of burnt powder. The .45-70 caliber bullet, a heavy slug of lead designed to stop a charging buffalo, struck Silas dead in the center of his chest. The impact threw him backwards, not with the rag-doll physics of a human body, but with the rigid, unnatural recoil of a statue being struck by a sledgehammer. He slammed against the far wall of the cabin, the wood groaning in protest. A dark, almost black stain spread across his woolen shirt. He slid down the wall to a sitting position. He did not cry out. He did not bleed in the conventional sense. The dark stain on his shirt did not drip. It seemed to steam a black vapor that smelled of ozone and frozen earth. Maeve's heart hammered. She had done it. He was down. But her training, the hard lessons of the frontier, screamed at her. A single shot was never enough. You always reloaded. Her fingers, numb with adrenaline, fumbled for the breech block, ejecting the spent cartridge. It clattered to the floor, a tiny, insignificant sound. She reached for the new cartridge she'd laid out on the bed, her movements jerky. She never made it. As she fumbled with the bullet, Silas's head lifted. His pale blue eyes were no longer calm or cruel. They were burning with a furious, otherworldly light, like gas jets ignited in the dark. The hole in his chest was smoking, and as she watched in horror, the edges of the wound began to frost over the tissue, knitting itself back together with an audible crackling sound, like ice forming on a pond in fast motion. That was a mistake, he hissed, his voice no longer a smooth baritone, but a layered, discordant sound like grinding stones and shrieking wind. He surged to his feet. He moved not like a man, but like a glitch in reality, a blur of motion that her eyes could barely track. He crossed the 10 feet between them in a single heartbeat. The world became a storm of violence. He lunged not for her, but for the rifle. His hand no longer looking like flesh, but like something carved from glacial ice, clamped down on the barrel. The cold was so intense, it was like being seared by a white-hot brand. She cried out, refusing to let go. They wrestled for the weapon, a desperate, silent tug-of-war. His strength was obscene. He was lifting her off her feet, the pressure of his grip bending the thick steel barrel. Maeve, fueled by terror and rage, swung her body, using her weight to slam him against the heavy oak table. The table splintered dishes and cutlery, crashing to the floor. He barely flinched. His other hand shot out and grabbed her by the throat. The cold. It was absolute. It wasn't just the chill of his skin. It was a life-draining void. Her breath hitched her lungs burning. Black spots danced in her vision. The warmth was being siphoned out of her, her life force draining away as if into a vacuum. Jeb, a furry bolt of desperate courage, launched himself from under the bed, sinking his teeth into Silas's leg. Silas glanced down at the dog with utter annoyance, as a man might look at a buzzing fly. Without releasing his grip on Maeve or the rifle, he kicked out with impossible speed. The impact sent poor Jeb flying across the room with a sickening yelp, and he lay still in the corner, a broken, silent heap. A guttural scream of pure animalistic fury tore itself from Maeve's throat. Seeing Jeb hurt her loyal companion, her last living link to normalcy, broke something inside her. The fear was gone, replaced by a white-hot, suicidal rage. She let go of the rifle. Her sudden release caught him off guard. As he stumbled back, clutching the now bent weapon, she acted on pure instinct. Her hand darted out and grabbed the one thing within her reach, the heavy iron kettle from the hearth, still half full of hot water from her morning coffee. It was heavy, awkward, but she swung it with all her might, a desperate, arcing blow aimed at his head. He tried to raise the rifle to block, but he was too slow. The kettle connected with the side of his head with a sickening, hollow clang, and something remarkable happened. He screamed. It was not a human sound. It was a high-pitched, unearthly shriek of agony, a sound that grated on the nerves and made the teeth ache. Where the hot iron had touched his skin, it didn't just burn. It sizzled and dissolved. His flesh melted away like snow under a hot sun, revealing not bone and muscle, but a swirling crystalline structure of black ice and trapped flickering light. The steam that rose from the wound was not water vapor. It was a cloud of black writhing shadows. Heat. Fire. It was his antithesis. He staggered back, dropping the rifle, one hand clawing at the horrific melting wound on his face. The illusion of the handsome stranger was literally dissolving, revealing the horrifying truth beneath. Maeve scrambled away her mind, seizing on this one crucial discovery. Fire. The fire in the hearth, which had been cowering, seemed to sense his weakness, and its flames leaped up with a sudden angry roar. Silas. His face a ruin of melting flesh and exposed shadowy frost. His eyes burning with undiluted hatred, lunged for her again. He was a wounded animal now, all pretense of control gone, driven by pure, malevolent instinct. Maeve darted around the broken table, putting it between them. She grabbed the iron poker from the hearth, its tip glowing a dull, angry red from the emboldened flames. "Get away from me," she screamed, brandishing the glowing poker like a sword. He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the glowing metal. The sight of it, the heat radiating from it, seemed to cause him physical pain. He snarled a sound of pure frustration and began to circle the table. It was a deadly dance in the ruined cabin. The elemental creature of ice and hunger versus the lone woman with a stick of hot iron. He was faster, stronger, but he was wounded, and he was afraid of the one weapon she possessed that could truly harm him. He feinted to the left, and she jabbed with the poker, keeping him at bay. The air crackled with tension, the only sounds the creature's ragged whistling breaths and the roaring of the fire. Maeve knew she couldn't keep this up. Her strength was failing her arm, trembling from the weight of the poker. She needed to end it. Her eyes darted around the cabin, looking for a final desperate gambit. And then she saw it. Above the hearth, next to the pegs where the Springfield had rested, was Liam's old powder horn and a small tin of kerosene for the lamps. An idea born of sheer desperation exploded in her mind. It was insane. It would likely destroy her home, and possibly her along with it. But her home was already violated. Her life already forfeit if she failed. She had one chance, one final desperate act of defiance against the storm he embodied. She took a deep breath, met his burning, icy gaze, and charged. Her desperate charge was a symphony of reckless motion, a final suicidal gambit against a being of impossible cold. It was not a charge at him, but past him. The move was so utterly divorced from the logic of survival, so contrary to the instinct to keep the threat at a distance, that it broke through his predatory focus. For a single critical moment, the creature known as Silas was thrown off balance. His claw-like hand, carved from what looked like frozen shadow, swiped through the space where she had just been a lethal gesture that met only empty, smoky air. As he turned, his ruined face a swirling nightmare of melting flesh and exposed black ice, Maeve was already across the room. She scrambled over the splintered remains of the oak table, her bare feet heedless of the shards of broken crockery. Her destination was the hearth, the heart of her home, now a raging inferno that seemed to pulse with a malevolent glee at the creature's weakness. Her hands, slick with sweat and grime, worked with the frantic, clumsy certainty of the damned. She seized the tin of kerosene, her trembling fingers fighting with the simple lid. It popped open with a spray of pungent fluid, splashing over her knuckles and the warm stones of the hearth. Silas was recovering, turning on her, with a speed that defied physics. The shrieking, layered sound of the blizzard returned to his voice, a sound of pure rage, and for the first time, utter panic as he understood her final insane intent. He was fast a blur of malevolent darkness, but his elemental terror of the heat of the ward untamed energy of the fire anchored him to the spot for one fatal heartbeat. It was all the time she needed. It was all the time the world would grant her. With a guttural scream that was equal parts prayer-curse and a final defiant farewell to the life she had known, Maeve did not throw the kerosene at the monster. She threw the entire tin into the roaring, waiting maw of the fireplace. The result was not merely a fire. It was an apocalypse in miniature. A concussive whoosh of violent orange and blue flame erupted from the hearth, a dragon's breath of pure, incinerating energy that engulfed the entire front of the cabin. The superheated air blasted outwards in a solid wave, a physical blow that lifted Maeve off her feet and threw her backwards across the room. She landed hard against the far wall, the impact driving the air from her lungs in a pained gasp. The flames, greedy and alive, did not hesitate. They shot up the wooden mantelpiece, instantly consuming the faded photograph of her and Liam that sat there. They clawed at the dry timber framing and the packed sods of the ceiling, finding purchase everywhere. But the fire's true fury was reserved for Silas. He was caught in the heart of the blast, and he screamed. It was a sound of ultimate, absolute agony and terror, a sound that did not belong in the natural world. It grated on the teeth, vibrated deep in the bone, and spoke of a pain so profound it could unmake creation. The wave of pure, dry heat washed over him, and his very form began to violently unravel. The heat was not just burning him, it was erasing him. He was no longer a man. He was a vortex of shadow frost and shrieking wind, a chaotic storm trapped in a dissolving human silhouette. The skin, the handsome mask he had worn with such devastating effect, sloughed off him in great steaming sheets. But instead of revealing flesh and bone, it revealed nothing, a void that seemed to suck in the light and air around it. The matter of his being dissolved into a black, greasy vapor before it could even fall to the floor. His entire essence, the very fiber of his ancient, cold existence, was being called away by the raw, chaotic energy of combustion. The cold abides. He wailed, his voice fracturing into a cacophony of 1,000 dying whispers, the words themselves seeming to freeze and shatter in the air. The hunger is eternal. He staggered backward, a puppet, with its strings cut, stumbling away from the inferno that was consuming him. His body was visibly shrinking, imploding the dimensions of the cabin, seeming to warp and bend around him. The crystalline structure she had glimpsed in his wound was now fully exposed, a horrifying skeleton of impossible, non-Euclidean geometry, a lattice of black ice that pulsed with a faint, trapped inner light. Under the relentless thermal assault, it began to fracture. Cracks spread through it, not with the sound of breaking glass, but with the deep, groaning report of a glacier carving into the sea. With a final deafening crack that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth, his form collapsed inward. There was a rushing implosion of air as the vacuum he created was filled a violent swirl of black dust and diamond-like frost that hung in the air for a second before it was instantly incinerated by the heat. And then he was gone. Silence. The unholy screaming had stopped. All that remained was a patch of floorboards covered in a rapidly melting, bubbling layer of black, viscous rime ice, and the lingering, unnatural chill in the air, a spiritual cold that was now being rapidly and violently consumed by the raging, natural heat of the fire. The cabin was burning. The realization cut through Maeve's shock with the sharp, clear clarity of a winter morning. Her home, her sanctuary, the last tangible piece of Liam she had in the world. It was being devoured by the very fire she had unleashed to save herself. A raw animal panic seized her. Scrambling to her feet, her body a symphony of new aches and deep bruises, she began to cough, the thick, acrid smoke stinging her eyes and clawing at her throat. Her gaze darted through the swirling smoke and dancing shadows, searching for one small, furry body. Jeb. The little dog lay where he had fallen, a crumpled heap near the base of her cot. A faint whimper reached her through the roar of the flames. He was alive. All other thoughts of loss, of terror, of the monster vanished. There was only Jeb. Ignoring the flames that were now greedily consuming the wall behind the hearth and spreading across the ceiling, she rushed to him. She scooped him into her arms, his body limp, his breathing shallow and ragged. He was hurt badly, but his heart beat against her hand. He was alive. Clutching her loyal companion, her last living link to the simple, loving world that had been shattered, she turned to the door. The fire was everywhere now, a living, breathing entity of destruction. The heat was unbearable. The smoke was a suffocating blanket. There was no saving the cabin. She had made a terrible choice, a trade of the most brutal kind. She had offered her home, her past, as a sacrifice to the fire. And in return, the fire had granted her a future. She threw the heavy wooden bar from the door, the same bar she had slid into place against the storm, and threw it open. She stumbled out, half falling into the dawn. The world that met her was so utterly at odds with the chaos behind her that it caused a fresh wave of disorientation. It was breathtakingly, blindingly white. The storm had passed as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world reborn. The landscape was a masterpiece of impossible beauty and profound silence. The snow lay in deep, pristine drifts, sculpted by the wind into graceful, sweeping curves. The rising sun caught the billions of ice crystals, setting the world ablaze with a cold diamond fire. The sky above was a vast canvas of pale, washed-out blue and gentle rose pink at the horizon. The air was frigid, so clean and still it felt like the first breath ever taken. After the claustrophobic violence, the roaring fire, and the unholy screaming, the absolute profound silence of the morning was both a balm and a shock. A few safe yards from the cabin, her legs gave out. She fell to her knees in the deep, soft snow, cradling Jeb to her chest, and watched her home burn. The sight was hypnotic. The furious flames raged against the serene white, a single violent pillar of orange, red, and black against the pale, quiet sky. She watched as the roof, held together by Liam's careful joinery, finally surrendered with a great groaning sigh, collapsing inward and sending a massive shower of golden embers spiraling up into the still air. They looked like reverse snowflakes, dark messengers of ruin ascending into the clean heavens. She watched as the thick sod walls, the very earth of the prairie that he had shaped into a shelter, blackened and crumbled. She watched until the violent roar subsided into a hungry crackle, and then a sullen hiss. She watched until there was nothing left but a smoking black wound on the face of the pristine snow. She felt nothing. Not grief, not terror, not even the grim satisfaction of victory. Just a vast, hollow emptiness. It was as if Silas, in his final dissolving moments, had succeeded in clawing out a part of her, leaving a void where her sense of safety, of belonging, once resided. She sat there for what could have been minutes or hours, as the sun climbed higher, its weak warmth a foreign sensation on her soot-stained skin. Time had lost its meaning. There was only the before and the now. Jeb stirred in her arms, his small body trembling. He managed to lift his head and with a pained whimper stretched up to lick the tear track on her chin. That simple, loyal, loving gesture was the key. It unlocked the gate. The dam of her shock did not just break, it shattered. A single sob, a raw, ragged sound tore itself from her throat. It was followed by another and another, until she was bent double in the snow, her body racked with a storm of its own. She wept. She wept for Liam, whose ghost had been exorcised from the land, along with the house he built. She wept for her loyal dog broken at her feet. She wept for her home, for the scent of baking bread and the sight of lamplight in the window. She wept for the woman she had been only 2 days ago, a woman whose greatest affliction was loneliness, a simple sorrow that now seemed like a precious luxury. And she wept with a terrible, terrifying awe for the knowledge of what truly lurked in the heart of a winter storm. Eventually, the tempest of grief subsided, leaving not emptiness, but a strange and terrible clarity. The tears had washed away the shock, leaving behind a core of something hard and unyielding. She had survived. That was the bedrock fact upon which she could now rebuild her world. Against a creature of myth and nightmare, a being of ancient hunger, she, a simple woman in a sod house on the plains, had survived. Carefully, painfully, she got to her feet, her body a map of agony, her muscles screaming in protest. She looked down at the smoking ruin, then out at the endless expanse of white. She would have to splint Jeb's leg, with sticks and strips torn from her hem. She would have to walk for miles, 5, maybe 6 in these drifts, to the nearest homestead, the Andersons. She would have to prepare a story about a tipped lantern, a tragic, stupid accident in the night. The truth was a madness she would have to carry alone, a story no one would ever believe, a story that she herself, in the bright, unforgiving light of day, would have to fight to accept as real. But as she took her first deliberate step away from the smoking scar of her past, leaving behind the ashes of her life and the ghost of an elemental evil, Maeve knew one thing, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones. She was no longer just a lonely widow waiting for the seasons to turn. She was a survivor. She was the woman who had stared into the frozen, hungry heart of the blizzard and had refused to be extinguished. The little flame of hope and warmth inside her, the one that had so fatally attracted the monster, had not gone out. It had been forged in the crucible of that terrible night into something else entirely. It was now a blade of fire, a shard of tempered steel. The cold had come for her. She had answered with femme, and she had won. The silence of the plains returned, but for Maeve it would never be the same. The memory of that night of the impossible cold and the desperate fire would forever be etched into her soul. She faced an evil as old as winter itself, a story that would never be told, a battle fought and won in the loneliest place on earth. Her story is a stark reminder that on the frontier, the greatest threats weren't always from bandits or beasts, but from the darkness that rides the wind, knocking on the door in the heart of a storm. If this tale of survival and terror sent a chill down your spine, please give this video a like to show your support. Share it with a friend who appreciates a Western with a dark, terrifying twist. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you don't miss another story from the dark and dusty corners of the Wild West. Thank you for listening.